Hello, everybody, and welcome to this screencast where we will continue the talk we've already had about distribution of different species. And you will soon see that we have actually started talking about some of the concepts from the ecology option already, right? So we have already talked about limiting factors, zone of stress, zone of intolerance, and interactions between different species. So I will just quickly sum up some of these concepts, and then we'll move on and talk about some of the new concepts, such as niche, competitive exclusion, and keystone species. And if we take a look at the guide first before we continue, then this is the first of the option topics, core topics. There are also some high-level topics, and we'll get to them later on. But you can see here, if we read through the understandings, that you should know something about the distribution of species and how that is affected by limiting factors. We have already talked about this. And then today we'll talk about keystone species and how they can affect community structure. And you should know that each species plays a unique role within a community because it has a unique combination of like habitat and interactions with other species. I will show you a table that you can use to sort of classify the different types of interactions that we have talked about between different species. And you will also learn today about this concept called niche and how two species cannot survive indefinitely in the same habitat if the niches overlap too much or if the niches are identical. And then there's some specific skills. And we can get back to this later on. We have already talked about some of them. You know about the symbiotic relationship between the zooxanthella and the reef-building coral. And we'll see some data to illustrate this thing with fundamental realized niche. Friday, you move outside and do a transect analysis. So we will get through this and hopefully actually cover this topic during the two modules that we have this week. But I just want to remind you that we have already seen two examples of distribution of specific species. So this is the reef-building coral, and the limiting factor for this one was the temperature. And we also looked at the deciduous oak tree and how that was also limited by too low temperatures up here or too high temperatures down here. And we saw this graph in a previous video. So we could have, in this case, it's just temperature, but it could also, we could have pH down here. We could have light intensity. We could have nutrient levels in the soil, many different things. And then different species would have like an optimum range of that particular resource down here. Or that particular variable. And then if the temperature, as it is in this case, becomes too low or too high, then we talk about this as the zone of stress. We would have a zone of stress down here and another zone of stress up here. And if the temperature becomes too high for any of the individuals to survive, we would refer to that as the zone of intolerance. And again, if it becomes way too low, we would also have a zone of intolerance down here. Yes, so just a quick sum up. And then you've seen this picture also, that we refer to or we have this concept called the most limiting factor, and that is the factor that determines the yield potential. We could also say that it's the factor that determines the size of the population. So how many bellas can grow in my lawn would depend on light and nutrient levels, temperature, how much space is available to them. And the factor that limits them the most is then what sort of determines the size of the population. So let's say that right now the most limiting factor is nitrogen availability in the soil. Then if I added a bit of nitrogen to my lawn, then the population would increase. But if on the other hand it was actually light that was limiting the population, then adding more nitrogen wouldn't really affect the size of the population because there would still not be enough light for the size of the population to increase. And then I promised you this table that shows or gives an overview of all the different types of interactions that we can have between species in a community. So we have these 5 out here: competition, predation, parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism. And they are defined according to whether they harm or benefit or leave the species unaffected, the two species that are involved in this interaction, right? So if it's competition, then both species involved are harmed. If it's predation, then one will benefit. That would, of course, be the one eating the other one. And the other species, the one being eaten, would of course be harmed by this. Parasitism, again, the parasite would benefit, but the infected host would be harmed. Mutualism means that they're both benefiting from this interaction. Commensalism is where one species benefit and the other one is unaffected. This could be, an example of the last one could be a tree being unaffected by the fact that a bird is building its nest in the tree, but the bird would of course benefit from this. And then another new concept, the concept the concept niche, right? And it is a little bit sometimes difficult to sort of wrap your head around and what this really means. So I'm gonna try to give you some examples of this. But you could say that what it says here in this picture, right? Different species here will live in the same or in a similar habitat. And the niche, the ecological niche, is how they then use the habitat or their unique way of living within that habitat. And one example are these 3 big predators, the leopard, the cheetah, and the lion. And they all occupy the habitat like grassland, and they all feed on larger herbivores, being in the same habitat as them. So they share the same habitat, but their niche is different because they use different hunting styles. So even though they would potentially compete for the same prey, then because they use different hunting styles, they don't actually compete with each other. They occupy 3 different niches, right? So the leopard is like an ambush predator. It lies around and waits, and then it ambushes its prey. And the cheetah is very fast and can do some very fast sprints. And the lions are hunting in groups. So they occupy 3 different niches within the same habitat. Another example is this. So the habitat is then an evergreen tree of some sort here. And then we have 3 different species of birds living in that same habitat. But they have different niches, right? Because they feed in different sort of levels in the tree, right? So we have one warbler that feeds at the tip of branches near the top of the tree, and we have one that feeds in the lower part of the tree and one that feeds in the middle. So even though they live in the same habitat, they don't compete for the same resources because they have different niches. And a very famous experiment sort of showing something about this and what happens if 2 species have a niche that overlaps is this one. So if you recall us when we talked about cell biology, we talked about the little paramecium, a eukaryotic cell, one-celled animal swimming around. And there are many different species of paramecium. And these can be grown in test tubes, and they can then be grown either alone, so one species in each test tube, or they could be grown 2 species together in the same test tube. And what this diagram here shows is then that in this case, if 2 species are grown together in this example down here, then one of them would outcompete the other one, and we refer to this as competitive exclusion. I have some graphs later on. Or what could also happen is that they could divide the niche between them, or they could occupy different niches within the same test tube habitat. And this is referred to as resource partitioning. So this is a graph showing what happens with the size of the population for 3 different species of paramecium if they are grown in their own test tube, right? So this species grown in its own test tube would grow to this population size, and this other species, again, if it's grown alone, it would reach this population size, and the Bossaria over here would reach approximately this population size. And this experiment was actually carried out by a Russian biologist in 1934-35. So he grew these 3 different species of Paramecium, both individually, as in this graph, and he then also grew them together. And as you can see down here, he supplied them with a constant amount of food every day. So what happens if they were then grown together? Well, this example shows that if the P. caudatum was grown together with the P. aurelia, then caudatum would be outcompeted. So, and the aurelia would completely take over the whole test tube. And this is an example of competitive exclusion. But in this other example over here, where the species caudatum were grown together with the species Bersaria, another thing happened. They actually ended up sort of splitting the test tube between them, so that one species grew in the top of the test tube, feeding on bacteria, and the other species grew at the bottom of the test tube, feeding on the yeast that thrive down there. And this is an example of resource partitioning. We could also refer to this as these 2 species occupying their realized niche. So we distinguish between the fundamental niche, which would in this case be the whole test tube. Both of them could grow in the whole test tube, but when grown together, they're left with only the realized niche, being either the top of the test tube or the bottom of the test tube. And one more example of this thing with the fundamental and realized niche. So these are 2 species of barnacles. And barnacles, that's a little crustacean. And it lives inside these tiny shells over here, and it can only live where it once in a while receive water. If there's no water at all, then it dries out. So it needs the waves to sort of splash, and it needs the tide to rise, so that it's once in a while covered in ocean water. And the fundamental niche of the brown species up here is this whole area. So it could grow from the lowest tide to the highest possible tides. And the blue species over here, its fundamental niche would be from the low tide until sort of the middle of the tide range. And it can't really grow up here. It's too dry, and too little water comes up here. But if the 2 species are then grown together, they would start to compete, and they would end up splitting the niche between them, so that the realized niche of the blue species would then be this region, and the realized niche of the brown species would then be this region up here. So a task that you are then asked to complete is this. You should write a cohesive text using these concepts: fundamental niche, realized niche, resource partitioning, competitive exclusion, limiting factor, niche, and habitat. And here is another concept that we can use when we want to describe how species living in the same habitat, being part of the same community, how they affect each other. And that concept is a keystone species. And if we start by looking out here at this picture here, then we can see that this up here is the keystone, and the keystone is what holds this whole structure together. And if we remove the keystone, then the rest of the stones, they would just the whole thing would collapse, basically. And we can use this concept to explain the sort of collapse of ecosystems if we remove what is referred to as a keystone species. And one example is this, of course, simplified community here, where we have a large predator, a shark, and then we have this cow-nose rays that are then secondary consumers, and then we have some primary consumers down here that would be bivalves, arthropods, other things living here at the bottom. And what would normally happen is that we would have a food chain established, right? So the rays would feed on the bivalves and the different arthropods, and the shark would feed on the rays, and they would sort of keep each other in place so that the population sort of is pretty constant, and there are not too many of those rays here in the middle of the food chain. What then happens is that if the shark is removed, and this happens sometimes due to overfishing, then there is nothing to keep the cownose rays in check, so to speak. So the population of these would start to increase a lot, and this also means that they would eat more of the bivalves and the arthropods. So the population of those would simply collapse, and some of them might even die out and disappear completely. And this would be an example of a collapsed ecosystem with no sharks and no bivalves and no arthropods, and then a lower biodiversity and a much more fragile ecosystem than it was before. And then here's another task for you, and there's a worksheet uploaded to the module that has this this worksheet in it, or this picture, these graphs in it. So based on what I just explained to you, I want you to use these graphs and this data and then answer the 2 questions in this worksheet. Bye for now.